don't know me, I'm a priest in Northampton, have a parish called dedicated to St Anne, God's grandma, and you always know that the grandson can never refuse the requests of grandma, which is why she's our patron, and she's very good to us. I used to serve here for a couple of years, and then before that lived in Scotland and served in Aberdeen and north east of Scotland. I suppose a caveat is that I'm not a theologian. Okay, that is not a theological piece. I'm a sociologist by background, and what I'm interested in is the way in which we construct our faith and the way in which we enact our religion in different contexts, in different places. And it occurred to me in thinking about this, and also thinking about a festival this weekend, that silence is probably one of the things that's least likely to happen. But also, it seems over the last few months, I don't know, have you seen the BBC television programme on the Great Silence? I think it's called The Great Silence. Yes, there's a few people.
I told everyone about it.
So you're all kind of as familiar about silence as I am in one way. But it struck me, partly that, and partly reading a book by a Catholic woman called Sarah Maitland, and a number of other events that have happened over the summer, that occurred to me, and I'll tell you what my thesis is here, is that we're almost being bombarded by this notion of silence. It's very prevalent, and we're being sold a notion of silence. And I wanted to understand a bit more about what this silence thing is that everyone keeps talking about, not just within Orthodox Christianity, but within other contexts. And I had the privilege, I guess, of listening to Terry Waite a couple of weeks ago. And Terry Waite was incarcerated. He was an envoy for the Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury, and had been kidnapped in the Middle East and was incarcerated for 5 years. And a large proportion of that was in solitary confinement. So I was, in my exploration of silence, very interested to listen to Terry Waite speaking for an hour or so about his experiences, expecting him to talk about silence. And he talked a lot about the preparation and the lead up to his being incarcerated, and talked about the conditions of his incarceration and his release, but actually was silent about silence, which got me even more intrigued. And also reflecting on our Orthodox Christian traditions, where silence, hesychasm, stillness is a very intrinsic part of our faith, or at least that's what we talk about a lot, is about hesychasm. But then, just even we were reflecting on the Vespers this evening, there's almost no room for silence in the Orthodox liturgy and liturgical material. There's an enormous amount of material, enormous amount of words to get through, even if we were monastics and we had all night to say the vigil or to say Vespers. There's still an enormous amount of work and words to get through. And it strikes me as a very complex contrast with the sense that our faith is intrinsically about silence, yet we use an enormous amount of words. I come from the Anglo-Catholic tradition, originally before I was Orthodox, and in the Western Christian traditions there's a very terse nature to the liturgy, to the offices, that they use almost the fewest possible words to express what they're trying to say. Even in the Reformed post-Vatican II tradition, where a lot of the meaning has been gutted, even if you look back beyond that into the Latin is, for me, a wonderful language because it expresses so much in just so few words, and is very terse and concise in its language. Yet the English translations of Greek and Slavonic seem very, very complex, very wordy. And it struck me, I was trying to understand what was the nature of this silence that we talk about, yet every time we come to pray, we stand up and talk a lot. And it seemed a bit peculiar. And my talk this evening is based around, or oriented around, my own experiences in trying to understand this over the last 20 odd years, this notion of silence. But my debt is to Sarah Maitland in the last few months, reading her book as a way of orienting myself and creating some sort of theoretical structure around rather kind of bemused and amused bletherings. And there's a number of little stories that come out, a number of little of aphorisms, and I was reading this morning about the Rabbi Lionel Ballou, who's very famous for his jokes, and one of his famous jokes, or very infamous jokes, is taken from the Goon Show. Anyone familiar with the Goon Show? English humour. And Harry Seacombe, one of the goons at the time, picks up, the telephone rings, he picks up the telephone. Hello? Hello? Who's there? Who's there? And the voice up there and says, "You're speaking." "Ah, I thought I recognised the voice." Puts the phone down. And it cuts to the very nature of what silence is, in the sense that we're too busy speaking and then when someone at the other end of the telephone actually speaks, we think it's ourselves and we can hear ourselves speaking back. And mixing the sublime with ridiculous, Abba Pambo in the Philokalia is asked to say a word or two to a visiting bishop, that his soul might be edified in this place, goes the story. And Abba Pambo says, "If he's not edified by my silence, then there is no help that he will be edified by my words." And that's like the old proverb of why keep your silence and be thought an idiot rather than opening your mouth and that status to be confirmed. And sometimes I feel like that. I teach for a living, and sometimes I feel like just shutting up and letting them think I'm stupid rather than just confirming it at every step. I teach in sociology and community development, and one of the primary writers in community development, one of the kind of the basic writers, is a chap called Paulo Freire from Brazil. And he says silence is oppression. He says that silence is waiting to be broken. Yet we try to enter into silence. We try to be silent. We go off to monasteries to be silent. We go out and walk in mountains in South Wales, North Wales, and find quiet places. Somehow the sound of birds is more silent than the sound of cars driving past the window behind me. And I find that quite peculiar, that we look for a different type of noise and call that silence. Even these people who went on this Ignatian retreat, this silent retreat, on the BBC television programme, spent a large amount of time talking, either to themselves or to camera, and breaking the rules, which is of course part of the deal of the BBC television programme. But even in that silence that they're trying to achieve, there's still an inordinate amount of noise. In preparation for this, I came across a film about a deaf woman, because I was starting to think about the nature of deafness, and I didn't get very far, but starting to think about the nature of deafness and silence. And there was this film about a deaf girl who witnesses a murder, and there's just a film clip. I didn't manage to reach the whole picture, but it was just the trailer for the film. And I was watching this trailer, and she's supposed to be deaf, but there was a huge amount of musical noise. It wasn't pleasant noise either. It was the car accident where the person gets run over is just a vast amount of noise. Yet this was a film about someone who was ostensibly deaf. So we have, I think, an ambiguous relationship with silence. Silence is a place of death, says Batsleer. Silence is waiting to be broken, says Paulo Freire. Silence is oppression. And how do we start to unpick this thing of silence when we're called to be silent? it's part of our spirituality, yet somehow it's not quite the silence we want. Even the name of it escapes me, but there is a chamber in a small building in Palo Alto in America. The technical term escapes me, but it's the quietest place on earth, where they've completely soundproofed it, totally soundproofed. There's no light in it because, of course, any light emitting electronics will create a noise. It's thought to be the quietest place on earth. Yet some people have said they can hear two sounds, one a very high-pitched sound and one a very low-pitched sound. Some people have tried to say, well, maybe that's the tectonic plates moving, and the high-pitched sound is the kind of the quantum particles through our atmosphere. But what's fascinating about this I think it's called anechoic chamber, is that you can't spend more than 45 minutes in this place without really doing your head in. I would leave it at this sense of doing one's head in. So I wonder what, and I'll fill that detail in a little bit in a moment. But just while I was driving over here, not listening to anything except the radio, but thinking about that notion of being able to spend 45 minutes in this place of total silence, yet that's what I've spent my entire adult life trying to achieve, is silence, and a place of silence, and then being given the stark notion that 45 minutes of silence is pretty much all I can really cope with without going mad. Which got me thinking about the C.S. Lewis's notion of heaven, that heaven is still the energies of God, but you experience the energy of God, the heat of God, as a searing light, rather than a place of verdure. And it occurred to me that if God is totally unknowable, we have this notion of God being totally unknowable, totally silent, totally other than everything that we can imagine, totally other than noise, totally other than even silence. What must it be like to be immortal and totally silent, like God? And as a human being, if I was given the blessing or the condemnation of being totally silent and existing in total silence, outside space and time, for immortality, I would last 45 minutes, and I would experience that as hell. To be totally silent for 45 minutes is utter hell. Yet, if we think about it, to be divine is to be outside, to be in heaven is to be outside space and time. And therefore sound has no meaning, because sound is motion. And therefore, without sound, surely for me as a human being, as a very impure human being, then that noiselessness, that soundlessness must be like hell. Again, an ambiguity here, because we then, in the Vespers and at various places, I have to dig out the prayer, one of the 6 prayers of introduction the one that I said. You who with never silent hymns and unceasing songs of praise. You seem to have this notion that heaven's a very noisy place. Holy, holy, holy are you. Constantly, unceasingly praising God, the archangels and the cherubim and seraphim. So why do we think that heaven is a very noisy place, but if we think of outside and space and timeless at a metaphysical level, that's totally silent? Looking to Sarah Maitland's work, and she's a practicing Catholic, she had been married to an Anglican priest, and she spent the last 10 years or so writing about and investigating silence as a process, and to begin with a 7-day retreat, and then a 30-day retreat, and a 40-day retreat, and now she lives in a hermitage in the south of Scotland, living and attempting to live a totally silent life. And it's a very good read. I'd recommend it, because I'm not going to do it justice. But she tries to create some sort of theory, some set of 7 features that she says that underline her experience of silence. And she looks through a number of Christian and other religious tradition stories, but also in secular life. Particularly, she focuses on the round-the-world sailors, particularly in the 50s and 60s, when there wasn't the noise of internet and global satellite communications. And some of the stories, and I'll pick up a few as I go through, but in particular, in 1968, in the Sunday Times Golden Globe yacht race, there are 3 names that come out of this: Donald Crowhurst, Nigel Tetley, and Morticia. And these are indicative of the negative aspect of silence. And the detail of it is that Donald Crowhurst went mad. Nigel Tetley committed suicide after his rescue in the South Atlantic, and Morticia stopped competing and never returned home. He just gave up and went to live on an island, claiming what you would call isolation, I call communion. Part of that's the negative aspects. And the positive aspect might be Debussy saying that music is the silence between notes. The features that Sarah Maitland established from her work and looking at these sort of stories, I'll go through them. Ineffability, the inability of the person who's experiencing this silence to describe what happened. Bright lights, hearing voices, extreme joy or bliss, what she calls boundary confusions, and I'll fill in the detail in a moment. The pursuit and awareness of risk and fear, and disinhibition. And these are some of the effects that she experienced while spending ever-increasing amount of time in extreme silence. Ineffability has often been expressed by being silenced by joy. It seems that to me that Terry Waite's talk about his incarceration expressed the ineffability, the fact he couldn't really get to grips. Either he chose not to, or he found it difficult to describe precisely what was going on in this. And to me, when I read the Felicalia, there's lots of aphorisms about silence and lots of stories about silence, but I find it very difficult to get behind the stories and that master-disciple questioning that goes on to find the experience of the silence. There's a lot of be silent and shut up and listen and go out into the desert and be silent. St. Anthony, for example, St. Mary of Egypt, those sorts of stories of utter silence, but nothing that I can find about the actual experience of being silent. This ineffability should suggest to me the devil's basic strategy, which is never to allow humans to be alone with God. In the Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis says, music puts into the words of the devil, music and silence, how I detest them. I'll come back to music in a moment. But this being silent, this total inability to express in human words what silence actually is and what the experience of silence is. There's the bright light, the intensification of physiological and psychological sensation. Sarah Maitland talks about porridge that she eats, and if anyone's eaten porridge, it's nothing to write home about. But for her, at one point in her journey, this simple porridge became the most delightful, blissful experience possible. It was the porridgeness of porridge. It was the best possible porridge ever. Just that simple thing. So lights become ever more intense, colours become ever brighter, sounds become sharper, and darkness becomes ever deeper. So it's like turning up the contrast on your TV. You don't do things like that anymore, but you used to be able to turn up the contrast on your television. That everything becomes much more significant, brighter, sharper. And there are hints in the stories of the saints of that sort of, particularly in the Western mystical tradition of those sorts of saints. John of the Cross and Teresa de Villa talk obliquely and poetically about these sensations. The hearing of voices, auditory hallucinations, and these are real. These are not kind of voices in one's head. These are not. This is not schizophrenia that these people are suffering. These are physical manifestations of voices. Some people have said that there are. The way Sarah Maitland expresses it is that there is an innate language that humans have. So any sound in times of extreme silence, any sound can start to sound like a human voice, because we lend an innate language to it. So even the singing of the wind through the sheets, the ropes on a yacht, after a while will start to take on a banshee sound, a sound as if someone's singing at very high pitch, and your psychology lends a voice to it. But in other circumstances, Joe Simpson in Touching the Void. Joe Simpson is the guy, there's a film about it, but also a book. Joe Simpson was a mountaineer, climber, and his partner fell off the mountain, taking him with him, and he ended up dangling below his partner, and in order to save himself, his partner had to cut the rope to let Joe drop several hundred feet, almost certainly to his death. And his partner, clearly that's a huge, difficult ethical issue, but Joe survived the fall, but landed with his leg jammed between two rocks, and had to cut his leg off in order to escape, and had to crawl several miles. Funnily enough, not funnily enough, that's probably completely the wrong word, strangely enough, actually arriving at the base camp before his partner. But the thing that Joe says about the voice that kept him going, this voice was clean and sharp and commanding. The other mind rambled on in a series of disconnected images and memories in a daydream state, but this clear voice keeping him instructed exactly what he should do, how he should do it, how he should escape, and making the decision to cut his own leg off was that other voice that was speaking to him. And this voice kept him going for, I can't quite remember the amount of hours, but we're talking about almost an entire day of crawling. As soon as he reached base camp, he collapsed into a complete physiological and psychological wreck. The voice disappeared. As soon as safety was achieved, that voice disappeared, and he was left a complete emotional wreck. So we're not speaking here about schizophrenic sort of hearing voices. There are clear voices, which reminds me of a tale I tell my students about the nature of medicine and the nature of the medicalisation of society. In America in the 1950s, a psychologist asked a few of his psychologist friends, his name escapes me now again, I should write these names down properly. He asked a few of his friends to present themselves to their local GP, and just to say, I hear a voice, not a schizophrenic type of voice, but hear a voice outside my head saying the word thump. Not to embellish the story, just to insist that this voice outside their head was saying the word thump to them. About 12 of his colleagues, all professionals, lawyers and doctors and stuff like that. All of them were incarcerated for insanity. All of them. And after several months they thought, well, it's about time we stopped the experiment. It was clearly that the psychological state is that all you have to do is say that you'll say something strange and you get incarcerated. So they went to the hospital. Don't forget, these are locked away hospitals. These are not just open hospitals. These are secure units. Go to the governor of the hospital and say, well, this is an experiment. I'm not really mad. And of course the answer was, of course you'd say that, you're mad. And they had to go to court to get them out of mental hospital. And it really lends the sense to which that this notion that if you pray to God, you're religious, but if God answers you back, you're schizophrenic. That it's just not acceptable for us to think in terms of disembodied voices. There has to be schizophrenia, has to be some sort of mental illness. But schizophrenia is persistent. If you hear voices in a schizophrenic sense, you are always hearing voices. It's very long-lived. Whereas the people who express these terms, and Joe Simpson's not the only one, it's short periods, over a short period of time. The extreme joy and bliss is partly related to the delicious porridge story, but the Mulville, another long-distance sailor, talked about being blissed out, melting into the sea, to the point that he almost stepped over the side in order to melt into the sea. And it was that close just to stepping over. And in my own experience, there's been times driving, of long-distance driving, where everything's very, very silent, and you're very, very close just to opening the door and stepping outside the car. And you're doing 70 miles an hour down the motorway, but just find yourself suddenly very, very close to doing something extremely stupid, but because you're blissed out in a white space. Some people often talk about entering into a white space, a kind of an infinity white space in one's head when these things happen. Just looking down through my list of other little aphorisms. No, nothing comes to mind. And then boundary confusions. If you eliminate clocks and electronic things and ticking things and etc., one's sense of time starts to eliminate and disappear. One of the problems with the Sunday Times Golden Globe yacht race, Donald Crowhurst, who went mad, was his electronics packed up, his timekeeping packed up, and therefore without a clock, without a precise knowledge of exactly what time it was, he wasn't able to work out where he was. Okay, because before GPSs and stuff, you had to know what time it was in order to calculate your latitude and longitude. So once you start losing sense of time and sense of place, then that was where he started going rather quite mad. This is Alice's White Rabbit, this loss of sense of time, being late, not knowing quite how to chop the day up. And also confusing one's voices or one's own words and thoughts with others. Sarah Maitland, when she was writing, found it really difficult to distinguish between what she had written and what other people had written. And what you say gets mixed up with what you've heard from other people. And part of the discipline of being an academic is being able to identify what was your thought and what was somebody else's, so you don't get done for plagiarism. And this is a big problem if you're seeking silence, as she was, in order to write. And very often people will seek silence in order to write, and the academic thing of locking oneself away in the office for 3 days in a row in order to, or working all night to get an assignment in on time. The danger is, and the experience of a number of people, has been this sense of mixing and confusing who's saying what and who said what. Being able to distinguish between internal and external stimuli, the boundary between inside and come to close total silence is in the middle of a snowstorm in South Wales, because of course the falling snow deadens all the sound and distances everything, so it becomes much more difficult to establish sound. And that's actually, I've been petrified as a 12, 13-year-old, absolutely petrified of that silence. But on the other hand, some have actually gone on to actually embrace that risk and actually become more risk-taking. So these notions of stepping outside the car or stepping off the yacht and stuff like that. And then the final one was this disinhibition, very much a part of our tradition, but also the tradition of St. Francis of Assisi, this fool's God, or the dishevelled nature of the hermit, the uncleanness of the hermit. St. Francis of Assisi, less well known, when being criticised by the local bishop, strips himself naked in front of the bishop, in front of the gathered crowds, and says, "This is who I am." And thankfully the bishop had the grace to remove his own chasuble and cover Francis of Assisi. But even Sarah Maitland and other people have explored extreme silence, have given up all the social graces, brushing one's teeth and getting washed in the morning, or doing washing up and stuff like that. And that's wasn't her normal nature as a normally fastidious and clean person. And it wasn't just a question of, I give up because I'm not going to see anyone, but the notions of just one's self-awareness and disinhibition, running around whooping with laughter and stripping naked and running across fields and stuff like that. It's not what I'm talking about here. But these sorts of behaviours come to the fore, which are all fascinating and wonderful activities. And it starts to help us to think about what actually might happen if we enter into the silence, what happens to us. Maitland, writing about his silence if I remember rightly, Maitland was one of the explorers of the South Pole. The silence was hollowing me out and leaving me empty and naked, he says. The separation. What's interesting, though, is that those 7 things that I've described, and what makes me very cautious about this notion of silence that people are being forced into, is everywhere. Dozens and dozens of books on silence. People are focused on Zen Buddhism. The NHS has got mindfulness programs as part of its well-being, etc., etc. Even I get my students to be silent in class, not just to listen to me, but just to stop and allow the silence to descend for a moment. And it's presented often as being intrinsically good. But the flip side to it is that some work done by a guy called Gracian on inadvertent or silence that has been forced upon somebody, like Terry Waite, is that the same features exist. The same features of silence exist, but they are flipped over. So the symptoms of someone who has been in silent incarceration for extended periods of time: hyper-responsivity, difficulties with thinking, concentration and memory, intrusive and obsessional thoughts, overt paranoia, panic attacks, impulsiveness, perceptual distortions, illusions and hallucinations. These are the psychological report of Gracian on long-term prisoners in solitary confinement in the US, including Guantanamo. These are his psychological reports, and Sarah Maitland actually points out that these are exactly the same as the 7 features that she's pointed out. She makes the contrast, for example, between the sense of being totally calm and the Gracian's report, which suggests that there's a breakdown akin to psychosis amongst these prisoners. And she refers to a situation where she was offered the opportunity to go into a flotation tank. We've ever seen these. You can get them in the airports now. You can pop in and wrap yourself up in a kind of a flotation tank, which is it's kind of water-filled. You get in fully clothed. It closes over you like a plastic bag, rubber bag, and it's full of just room temperature, blood temperature water. So you feel as if you're floating, and then they switch all the lights off, so there's no sound around you, so you can't hear what's going on. This is in the middle of Schiphol Airport. I've not tried it, but I've seen people do it.
So why just to calm it down, or why?
Stress relief. Okay, this is supposed to create a sense of stress relief and transcendence and calming, etc., etc. And if you read the brochures for these things, amazing things are going to happen, world peace and etc. But she said the technology is sensory deprivation tanks, which is a process designed by the CIA to extract information under torture, conditions of torture. The sensory deprivation tank is a torture chamber. It's exactly the same technology, called a flotation tank, but it's exactly the same thing. So we see here that actually, if we to artificially create this sense of silence through this notion of a flotation tank or sensory deprivation, that the same things happen, the same sensations happen, but the ability of the human psyche to respond to them is flipped over. So rather than being a wonderful, blissful experience, they're an awful experience. And it kind of suggests to me almost this, the presence of the demons of the desert hermits. I want to explore the other side that people don't necessarily connect to the silence, but thinking about the silence of death and the silence of sleep. And the Greek word, and I'm going to mispronounce it, but I call it akadie, is that right?
Akadia.
Akadia in the Greek. That Cassian, John Cassian particularly refers to, akin to dejection, the midday listlessness or inertia, a lassitude of body and craving for food as one might feel after an exhaustion of a long journey. One is slothful and vacant in every spiritual activity, says Cassian. In paraphrasing Psalm 91, he says, "You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the demon that lays waste at noonday." And this is a fairly well-known effect of living in silence, that at some notion of noonday, one becomes totally listless and unable to do anything, totally dejected. Richard Burton, a Western writer, in The Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621, talks about the difference. He understood even then the difference between depression and akadia. Let's pronounce it again. In the desert, in the silence, says Dalrymple in The Holy Mountain, you can find yourself. But the flip side is you can also lose yourself in this silence, that it can get to the point where you're unable to do anything, even when you're just about to die of thirst. The thought of actually getting up and reaching across to the table to pick up a glass of water, Thomas Merton experienced this, means that it's impossible. Just the listlessness of the everyday life. And to be aware that the same things that we do in silence, or when we seek silence, we have two options. Particularly if silence is forced upon us, if we're made to be silent, the same effects that Sarah Maitland points out start to occur. If we choose it, we also have this danger of the midday listlessness that find my notes here. Alexander Selkirk, of Robinson Crusoe fame. He was the man behind the story of Robinson Crusoe. He, in his own writing on it, not the Robinson Crusoe story, he grew dejected, languid and melancholy, scarce able to refrain from doing himself violence. The dreadful howlings and voices seemed too terrible to be made for human ears. And his response is rigorous busyness. He goes and builds palisades everywhere. He goes and builds protection around this tiny island, constantly making protection. But it's not unknown. Abba Paul in the Porphyria desert made palm leaves all year, and then when his cell was too full, he set light to the palm leaves and get rid of them, and then started making palm leaves all over again. Why? It's what a stupid thing to do. Why make these palisades? Why get involved in the minutiae of the detail? Why, winding back almost to the start, why do we have so many words in the services? Why does the monastic tradition within the church have so much words and so much rhythm and so many break sections of the day? Because to allow the sense of time, to allow the sense of time passing, to create rigorous, detailed activity whilst being silent. So Richard Burton, writing in the Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621, he says depression should be treated with gentleness. Clinically depressed, you treat someone with rest, gentleness, and relaxation. But this midday demon of lassitude should be dealt with by strict rule, self-discipline and hard work. So our notions of going away to South Wales or North Wales and having a nice gentle retreat for 7 days and being silent is in danger, and it's not talked about in that programme, at least the parts of the programme I saw. But all of those people involved in that in the Good Great Silence programme suffered from this noonday demon of lassitude, because there was little structure to their life, very little things to do. They started losing sense of time, unable to do anything, just sitting around, so bored. Have you ever come across this? You're so bored that you can't even read. You go away for a retreat, a well-earned retreat for 3 days, to get some reading time, and you've got peace and quiet and silence, and you've got the book in front of you, and you just can't bring yourself to read the book because you're so darn it bored.
You are just tired. If you sleep 3 days before that, then you start reading my book.
It's got so bad with me now that we had an experiment last Sunday to have the liturgy at 12 o'clock, and I had a stupid mistake of staying in bed until kind of 10 o'clock rather than being up at 7 o'clock. And could I get anything done for the rest of the day? The liturgy was bad, I felt grotty and miserable, etc., etc. So the monastic lesson is that I'm never going to do it that time again, it's 9 o'clock or else. The monastic lesson, I think, is then to think about the sense in which we create structure through the prayers and through those words. So it's not that those are vast amounts of words, or we have 3 stases of the Psalter, for example. It's not that we have to trudge through them as rapidly as possible, but we use them to mark time, to create time, which is why in Byzantine tradition, the sung tradition is extending the words rather than making those words staccato, is extending the words and fulfilling the time full of palm leaves, which ultimately at the end of the liturgy we set light to and get rid of, but we return again and again to that. Again, it gives us a problem in terms of the nature of silence. And kind of last 2 quarters of what I'm going to try and say, because we have to go back, having looked at what silence is and what the experience of silence is, the problems of silence, the problems of the psychology of silence, and some of the activities of the monastics to fill that. We do have a wider problem here of the nature of God. We have a wider problem with the nature of God anyway, but in the sense of if we're pursuing silence, are we pursuing God? And if we seek silence, are we starting to get to the point where we start to treat silence itself as our God rather than the God that lies behind it? And why is that a problem? Because we often think of God as being silent. I've already expressed this notion of God as being silent, so totally other than us. Yet at the very start of our scriptures, God breaks the silence. God's creative act is to speak. Okay. Breaking the void. Silence in a lot of creation myths is a place of non-being. I'll read a writer, I didn't note down who wrote it, I apologise, who said, after the beginning was the Big Bang, If you're a secularist, you believe in the Big Bang. After the beginning was the Big Bang. And this is a sound in the silence of a vacuum. Even our secular notion of the start of everything is a sound. A Big Bang, not a very good one. I think our mythology is slightly more interesting to read. But God breaks the silence with a word. With the word, but also with a word. Which is interesting because of all the mythologies, although the mythologies of the creation of the earth often start off with this notion of a void, of a nothingness, how creation happens is very fascinating, very varied. Ingesting, brooding, birthing, killing, withdrawing, defecating, vomiting, masturbating, copulating, desiring, self-mutilating, all by mistake, if you work through the great world religions. And you can go and find them out. They all seem to be an emanation of something, particular physical manifestation. The Norse myth, fascinating. Okay, the Norse myth, cold, dark, and salty ice is the pre-creation. And the cow, name escapes me now, the cow licks the salty ice and licks out the giant Ymir and feeds him with milk. And that is the start of everything. This notion of emergence from something. In the Egyptian, there's lots of complicated Egyptian creation myths, but in one of the Egyptian creation myths, the limitless expanse of dark, sullen and inert water. Remembering desert here, water is quite important. An atom creates himself out of nothing and stands on the ground. And forgive me, I'll continue it. My fist became my spouse, very bleakly, and I sneezed out Shu, and I spat out Tefnut. 3 moments of creation. One of which is masturbation, the other one is sneezing, the other one's spitting out. Even in ancient Greece, the first god is Chronos, time. The moment time is created, motion is created, space is created, therefore we have material life. In Zen Buddhism, what is the way? Asks the disciple. It is right before your eyes, comes the answer. Why do I not see it? Because you are thinking of yourself. The Quaker Pierre Lacourt, words must be purified in a redemptive silence, he says. Speech has no meaning unless there are silent hearts. So even in the Christian tradition we think of God as being silent, but God speaks. His word is Christ, and the creation of everything is let there be. So for me, I start moving away from this notion of God as being silent and holiness as being necessarily silent. If God speaks in order to create, then theosis is not necessarily silence. Silence is a part of it, but the creative act of speaking and naming is also part of that holiness. So we must be cautious, I think, of pursuing silence alone without understanding the intersect between silence and sound, words. Bauman, in the 1980s, spoke of Quaker silence as being a highly symbolic, communicative act. If you're a Quaker, you come together, you sit in a room in a circle for an hour, being totally silent. But if you watch very, very carefully, and I've been in a number of situations where I've had this opportunity, watch very, very carefully, there is a liturgy going on in that silence. That there is an assent, there is someone who is identified as being the leader, the person who starts the time of silence, the person who has been nominated, at least charismatically, to stand up and give an offering of some words of wisdom, and someone who controls time, someone who says when the hour is up, someone who stands up and closes the meeting. So in the minutiae of it, there's still liturgy. Even in a non-liturgical, non-Eucharistic tradition, there is still liturgy, because it's a symbolic act of coming together and being silent that is liturgical. And there's an inherent ambiguity between that, between the mental silence and the verbal silence, the listening in the noise. Von Hugel says, man is what he does with his silence. And we go off and we try and be silent, we go to the monastery and sit there for a few moments in silence, and within seconds we're thinking of that argument we had last week, and if only I'd said this I would have won the argument, or the shopping list comes to mind, and etc. So we become verbally silent, but mentally the demons shout even more loudly, and creating the internal stillness, the internal silence, is an even greater challenge. It's not just about shutting everything up and switching everything off and going off somewhere to listen to birds and to simplifying our external noises. We also have the internal voices, the internal noises that are in the way. Sarah Maitland has attempted, and other people like her have attempted, to go beyond that and to deepen into mental silence. But what she says is the result is that one becomes totally, significantly more perceptive of physical noise, external noise. So the quieter your mind gets, the noisier the world becomes, effectively. So if you're pursuing total silence, it's difficult. It's partially compensated, but what we start to do is enter into the spirituality of noise, and understanding noise and silence as a communicative act. So in music doesn't make any sense unless it has silences in it. In writing, we create silences in our writing. If you think about the way I'm speaking, there are no grammatical marks in the way I'm speaking, no gaps between the words and spaces between the words, no full stops, etc., etc. I'm not saying full stop and brackets, etc. It's all a long stream. And we used to write this way. We used to write in a long stream of all the letters after one another, and it's really difficult to interpret. Try it. Put all the words together, get rid of all the spaces, just put them all equidistant apart, with no grammatical diacritics or anything like that. And it's really difficult to understand what's being said. So in writing, we create silences in between our words. We create spaces, gaps of silence. We create diacritical marks, grammatical marks, to help us to navigate the balance between noise and silence, noise and silence, noise and silence. And same with music. Music, as we know with John Cage's piece of work, 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence, draws our attention to the fact that music is made up of silences and the use of silence. So it's not silence that we're looking for on its own, it's silence in the context of noise, and noise in the context of silence. So we've looked at silence as a biological function. We've looked at silence as a physical manifestation. We've looked at silence as a cultural artifact. We've looked also at silence as social relation, in the Quaker context, in God speaking. Silence is also political and powerful, choosing when to be silent, choosing when to speak. Overcoming oppression is overcoming the silences. There's a film around which is called The Overcoming the Silence, which is about the complete lack of coverage in international press of the rape and murder of Rwandan women. But also, silence is communication in its own right. Silence is not the absence of noise. Silence is the intersect of noise and non-noise. So silence itself becomes communication. God speaks, and in the act of speaking creates time. And the act of speaking creates material, it creates space and time. And therefore we can say silence is love. But at the same time, we hear in the St. James liturgy hymn, "Let all mortal flesh keep silent." Words I've used on J.M. Neal's version, a paraphrase of Habakkuk 2:20. So, in order to explore silence, we need sound. We cannot escape sound. And if we are to seek pure silence, we're seeking something that is other of God. That we are to seek sound in noise, silence in noise, and noise in silence. John Climacus points to this in a very oblique way, and I've finished with his quote from his Ladder of Divine Ascent in step 27. Stillness of body is the understanding of habits and emotions, and the silence of the soul is knowledge of one's thoughts. A wise hesychast, not all hesychasts are wise, a wise hesychast has no need of words, being enlightened by deeds rather than by words. Such stillness is the unceasing worship and waiting on God. So for us, the spiritual tradition is not of silence in its own right. It is the stillness of body. But the stillness of body comes out of knowledge of one's habits and emotions. Being aware of one's thoughts, aware of actually the process of thinking, rather than just thinking. Knowing that one is thinking doesn't require total silence. You can do it on the bus on the way into town. To become aware of your thought processes, and aware of how you think and why you think and how words and ideas come to your mind without invitation. The silence of soul is the knowledge of one's thoughts, understanding that all these thoughts, all these emotions are presented to you, and you have the opportunity to look at them, observe them, and put them aside. Not to suppress the words and noise and to try and tamp it all down as one tamps a fire down to prevent the flame. Because that suppresses and represses, that then becomes akin to psychosis, it's akin to that sensory deprivation. But to see the words, to objectify the thoughts, and to see them and to know those words, to know your own thoughts and to be aware of your processes of thinking. So the wise hesychast has no need of words, but is enlightened by deeds rather than words, which points us towards the necessity of doing, as well as think I find the silence in the noise and sound of the liturgy and the sound of the offices. That when we've said it and we've become bored with it, we've become distanced ourselves from the words, because it's very difficult. I challenge any of you to sit and actually listen intently to every single word that is said in the vigil on Saturday night, without breaking your concentration once. It's inordinately difficult. It does remind me of the image of the Zen Buddhist image of sitting down in a room with a lit candle, and the master says, listen to the candle. The flame, of course, not the wax. Listen to the flame. That in that flame, in that silence, in that rhythm of the sound, and the intersect between sound and silence, is where we start to perceive God. In the activities of our life, we start to perceive the silence that exists, rather than saying, I must run away from life and find a farm somewhere and be silent, and run off to a monastery and be silent, not silent places. But in the everyday life, I suppose I'm influenced here by the Brother Lawrence's practice of the presence of God. That if you're able to perceive stillness and silence while peeling potatoes in the kitchen, then you can truly understand what it is to be holy. The unceasing worship and waiting on God is the stillness and silence itself. God himself says, be still and know that I am God. In silence, in the sound, and importantly in that gap, in that space between silence and sound. And that, I hope, is where we can find true theosis and true spirituality. Not in seeking silence, but in allowing God to speak to us through his silence, and in that ambiguity, in that contradiction, in that tension between sound and silence. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's helpful, useful.
When they do hand washing,
Yes.
it's very good. It's a very good moment to find.
Yes. In the
Monotony
mind.
is enough. It's pleasant in a way because samponize comes out of your hands and it's calming.
Yes.
I guess it's different for each
It's
person.
different for everyone. Some people like ironing. I can't imagine why, but
No.
it's not escaping from from the everyday life. It's finding God in that everyday life, and seeking the silence and finding the silence that is present. Cool.
The last example that you gave of listening to the whole vigil without your mind wandering, I find that very curious, because the first time when you listen to the vigil, you are actually quite attentive, but maybe the 10th time or so, and it happens when someone speaks. I mean, you spoke to us for about the same time that vigil would
Yes,
pass.
and you all were very attentive.
Yes, but I didn't feel the need to think about my shopping
Yes.
list. Oh.
But if I said this again and again and again and again and again and again with the same words, it would be very problematic. There was a poet who stood up and said, over the space of kind of 40 minutes, the same line. It was about 3 lines, I think he said, that he intersected with one another as a refrain. And after, halfway through this, woman stood up and said, "I know you, I love you dearly, but this is driving me insane." But he was pointing to the notion of liturgy, the notion of boredom within, and the repetition. But the repetition is important in structure, because in repetition we get the sense of time. When we've gone through one stasis, we've got a sense of time has moved on and another stasis. If we read the whole of the Psalter in one go, end to end, we start to lose a sense of time. So the structure of the liturgy is structured in order to give us a sense of time, liturgy in the offices. So we structure time with our prayers. But when we get to the point where we've heard the same psalm again and again and again and again, then that's where we start to hear the silence and distance ourselves from the words that are being said, and listening to the silence that's between you and the person saying those words. Does that make sense? That's how I feel sometimes. So I become distanced.
But not thinking about something.
Not thinking about something else, no, just for a brief moment. You're blessed with that notion that the words are still going on, and you can hear them, you're not attentive to them, but neither are you thinking about the washing up or the shopping or whatever. And it's a precious intersect of time. And then it's gone. Usually gone.
I thought I'd share something with people about this experience that I had. I became Orthodox quite recently. I was just baptised this year. So a couple of years ago, before I knew anything about the Orthodox Church, I hadn't really heard of it, I thought it might be nice, it was coming up to Easter, I thought it might be nice to sort of find a chapel and stay up all night and pray all night. And I didn't really know that people did that, but thought that it sounded like it would be quite fun. And I managed to persuade about 6 friends too, and we found a chapel that we could sit and one of our friends had actually sort of done something similar before, and he said, "What are you planning to do?" And I said, "Oh, we're just going to sit in silence. We're going to fast all day, and then we'll just pray all night in silence." He said, "That would be really quite difficult, and it might be nice to break up the night with perhaps reading an office or something every couple of hours." And I said, "Well, if you think that's necessary, all right, then we'll do that." And so we did. We had this little chapel up the Cowley Road, and we went in this chapel. And it was quite cold, and I didn't realise that when you haven't eaten anything all day, you feel even colder, And there was no heating of this chapel. It's a kind of little heating of this chapel. So as the night wore on, it was agony all night, and I was so looking forward to the times where we would have 20 minutes every hour and a half or so, where we would read some office that he found, some liturgy, something to read anyway, that would kind of break up that time. And I was just really thinking, it can't have just been 20 minutes.
Yes,
so I'm really pleased that the Orthodox Church does have some, even in all night liturgies, there's some chanting or something going through the night, because it really makes it much more bearable.
Yes, particularly I think when you experiment, if you're coming from a particular tradition. I baptised someone recently who also said he wanted to, he wanted to stay up all night every time. I don't know why I think. I'm not to sleep in a chapel when his bones are too sore. But this notion of coming from noise straight into something that's an all-night vigil. In Orthodoxy, particularly in a monastery where one is dedicating one's whole life to silence, at least to trying to achieve hesychasm, a state of stillness and silence, then the necessity for the length of those offices to structure time over not just 12 hours overnight or 7 or 8 hours, but over 72 hours, over hundreds of hours, over weeks and months and years, without losing a sense of time, because that seems to be, particularly in the secular stories, the moment where people are most likely to go insane is when they lose their watch, when their watch breaks, they're unable to calculate what time is, and particularly if they're travelling and unable to work out where they are, without any clear sense of time and space, that they start to become unhinged. It's very interesting. So thank you for that. That's kind of very practical notion of trying to live over one night.
One more question. Well, you mentioned deaf people at the beginning. How come deaf people don't hear voices or see lights or feel bliss? They don't hear anything for their whole life, maybe. So.
Yes, I'm afraid I can't give you any insight onto that. I'd come back to me in a few months' time once I've explored that, because there is that notion of when people are deaf. If you're born deaf, how you actually cope with that notion of silence.
Or even worse, if you go deaf in the middle of your life.
Look, I know a boy who lived in this house when I was a DPhil student, Dimitri Benico, someone you might know him. What he did, because he was very educated and very clever, all his attention was focused on learning languages. So he learned Aramaic, Armenian, languages which are not compulsory connected. So it depends also on each person what they may say.
Yeah. But the attention to visual perception and tactile perception becomes much more distinct and acute, and therefore the attention to detail of language and words, etc. And being, of course, he's not completely deaf because he's seeing communication. To quote a rock band, the Deaf, Dumb and Blind Kid is the one that is, or the autistic child is the one that's closest to this sense of being almost insane and losing sense of grip on reality. Because if you're blind as well as deaf, then increasingly difficult to see communication, and therefore be part of communication. Of course, then you still tactile communication, but so the people who've gone completely overboard are particularly those whose total sensory deprivation of being completely blind, completely deaf, and completely unable to touch anything. So in the anechoic chamber, it's all soft velvety stuff, so you touch and there's no sense of shape or anything that you can possibly touch, because it doesn't have any resistance that you can feel. Nice.
Yeah. It's better with the chairs, they have this chair where you put one coin and they massage you. That is better.
That's good enough, yes.
I just wonder, because when you're in silence, you touched upon this, I think, briefly. When you're in silence and you're more concentrated on your own thoughts, without being anything distracted. I wonder what is the Orthodox perspective on this, as you're saying, because are all the thoughts considered ours, or if not, how can we distinguish that sometimes we have some really weird thoughts and because they're not from God or from someone else. So or is it just all superstition? And how can we distinguish? I don't know whether my question is...
No, the monastics and the Philokalia seem to have, someone said they seem to have a very sociable internal life, that their heads are just totally chock full of demons, and they use the terms demons that are introducing these words and these notions, these thoughts. So kind of, they're almost schizophrenic in the sense that they've got lots of voices chattering on their heads. And I find it very difficult to work out, there is that notion of, is it the words from God, that often people say, I've had a word from God, or God's telling me to do this, etc., and how far does that go before you are clearly insane? But also, this notion, of course, I killed my wife because God told me to, often appears in criminal court cases. The notion of who is introducing the thoughts and whether we have any control on it, that becomes a big problem of human agency. Is it my thoughts, or are they the thoughts of demons that have been presented from outside? And I don't think the answer lies in saying they're definitely mine or they're definitely somebody else's, because clearly they come from almost nowhere. They seem to come from nowhere. The Freudians might say they come from our deep subconscious, so they are within us, we just don't see them, don't perceive them, and control them. And I guess the notion of descending one's concentration of perception into the heart, into the organ of perception, the heart, is to peer into the id, into the unconscious, that psychologists will talk about, to try and see where those words, those notions, those ideas are coming from, and not to control them, but to be able to observe them. And it seems the monastics are clearly not telling you to control your thoughts in the sense of repressing or grabbing hold of these thoughts as if you have some control over them, but not to entertain them. They say, look at them and put them aside, not to allow that thought to fester. So, are they from outside, inside? Is that even necessarily the right question? They are our thoughts. We have responsibility for our thoughts. Christ says that if you look upon someone with lust, then that is tantamount to being lustful. So therefore, that we have responsibility for our own actions and our own thoughts. We have the responsibility to appropriately address those thoughts and to put them aside when they're inappropriate thoughts, and to entertain the good thoughts and decide between them, rather than being led by our passions. Is what the way in which the interpretations go, is that we're led by our passions. Well, these are just thoughts.
And in practical terms, what you're supposed to do is to check with people around you, and if that doesn't help, go to your confessor and see.
Yes, there's the traditions of the church, and to check with other people. But if you do that seriously, then you spend a lot of time speaking to your spiritual confessor, because these thoughts never stop, and you're checking every thought. Extreme thoughts, yeah. But we are called, but in stillness terms, we are called not to try and prevent thoughts happening in the Zen Buddhist sort of way of emptying one's mind. And preventing thoughts happening, clearing one's mind, but to actually to be aware of those thoughts and the influence of those thoughts upon the way in which we act.
I just, in this context, I liked the phrase of, I think, one of the elders or someone else who said, well, we can't prevent birds sitting on the trees. Actually taking their seats on the trees, but we can let them not staying there.
Yes, we can make sure they fly away. Yes, I think we've forgotten that one.
It's 9 o'clock, I don't know.
Which is much better timing than last time I spoke, isn't it?
Oh, that's not.
No, I'm bad. I went on forever last time, didn't I? So, thank you for...
Over.
Yes, I'm sure you...